Hi, I'm Andy Acton.
And I'm Chris Strevens.
This is Dentology, the Business of Dentistry podcast. So this week, it's one of our little special episodes where it's just me and you.
You and me.
Exactly, no guests this week. So let's delve into our daily world of the buying and selling dental practices.
Makes sense.
And let's look at what are the big mistakes that people make when selling a dental practice. The biggies, the things that people should really avoid.
That sort of like blow it out the water.
Yeah.
Or they end up getting the wrong deal.
Yeah.
What would be the first one? I suppose the first one has got to be a bit like buying a house, really. Get a valuation. You know, get a proper valuation, not. Well, we all know, don't we? Dental practices. What do we reckon? They're getting a letter a day, a contact a day, whatever it might be, saying, "Sell me your practice, sell me your practice, sell me your practice. I'll pay you X pounds for it." And I think where it seems to go a bit wrong is there's obviously a bit of flattery, don't you think? You know, someone says, "Oh, I want to buy your business."
Yeah, for sure.
So somehow, but it seems to be, and I suppose this is from our experiences, people seem to almost take that and mistake that flattery for genuineness. And that doesn't mean that the people who send you the letters are dodgy, but as in the fact it almost creates this sort of false sense of well-being. So therefore, when that person who sent you that letter, who knocked on your door, who sent you the email, whatever it is, says, "Oh, I think your practice is worth £1 million," there's somehow in their head, the practice owner sort of thinks that's a fair, genuine price.
I think it's easy to get caught up in the moment, isn't it? That, like you say, there's a degree of flattery that if somebody offers you an amount of money and suddenly you get caught up that, wow, I've been approached, my practice is really special. And then you kind of end up in a process of some sort, but you never step back and be like, okay, so what is it actually worth? Not what somebody who's telling me it's worth, who wants to buy my practice. What's it actually worth independently? And I think you're right. And that is a huge mistake, because if you do get it independently valued, and whether they use us or whoever, the point is get it independently valued, because it will either give you peace of mind that the letter that came through the door was fair and that value was about right. So you've got peace of mind, or it's going to be a tool to negotiate from. There's no downside to that. And the amount of times we hear where people have proceeded down that path, and some of them stop just in time, and you can step in and help those people, and other people it's too late.
Well, what's that one? We always love a story, and these are real stories. So I think that they have a massive ability to land on people. And there was that practice where the associate had offered, I think it was 750 or 850,000. And said to the seller, and okay, guys, if you're listening, this is a red flag, okay? And he said, don't contact Frank Taylor and Associates to get a valuation because they will overvalue, I think was the phrase that the associate used. So if anyone says that to you, I think that's your big red flag, because obviously the only reason you don't want someone to value it is because you might then find out what the true value. And we valued it, and I think we valued it. Was it double?
Pretty close to
what the associate had offered. Now, you can either take the view that the associate was naive and didn't understand what the true value was, or the flip side is that the associate knew what the true value was, and the red flag I'm waving here, and wanted to get it for significantly undervalued. Now, fortunately, as Andy says, the seller saw the light and asked, because the red flag, and the end result was that the associate, and I think they may well have parted company. I don't honestly know, actually. But the whole thing was, don't believe what someone tells you, especially if it's the person who wants to buy the business, because it's highly unlikely that, one, they're going to have the right price.
Yeah.
And also, you just want to know, don't you?
Of course you do.
So that's got to be that's got to be number one on the list of
That's
things that you should do before you start to
I think another mistake people make is they completely underestimate how much time it takes to prepare the documentation to sell. So when you go into a legal process, your solicitor will have to prepare what they call a due diligence bundle. And that's going to be everything from employment contracts to service contracts for your compressor, your NHS contract, your lease, all your CQC documentation, your financial accounts. It's going to be everything, all the bits of paper that relate to your practice. And the gold standard would be to get those on a drive, a digital copy of all that documentation before you start the process. So you can pass it to your solicitor within a day or two. The reality for most people is it can take them 2, 3, 4 months to work through that. The challenge that brings is you lose momentum in the transaction, which is critical.
Definitely.
You need that momentum.
Data gathering,
yeah, but also selling a business is stressful. So now you just added another layer of stress onto everything else you've got to do. But also it potentially puts your team on notice that you're selling because your behaviour will change.
It's true.
Because you'll start hanging back at the practice late at night or going in at weekends because you're putting up paperwork. And your team, we're all quite good at spotting behaviours within the people we work closely with.
Very true.
So if suddenly the principal starts changing how they behave, there's a risk that people can think, well, what's going on there? What's happening? So I would urge people to start really early, get that paperwork together, just file it somewhere so that when the time comes, because genuinely I believe you could knock 3 months off your transaction time if you're ahead of the game and you have your paperwork ready.
And I think, going back to another story again, where we had that guy, didn't we, with somebody who sent their practice and they didn't do their due diligence for, I think it was 6 months. And everyone kept saying, do your due diligence, and eventually they did it. Transaction went through, and then something towards the end of the transaction occurred. I can't quite remember what it was. I think it might have been something to do with an associate or something. And the purchaser sort of stuttered a bit, and the vendor got very grumpy about it. And we were able to say, if you'd have done your due diligence when you should have done, you wouldn't actually be owning this practice anymore.
Yeah.
And I think people, do you think people still think it's done like with a handshake down a pub or whatever?
I think there's probably a possibility that some of them do. I think it's when did you buy your practice? If you bought your practice 20 years ago, I think the process back then was way simpler than it is now. If you
no NHS, no CQC.
So if you bought your practice in the last 10 or 12 years, you're probably a bit more au fait with what it's like. But I think related to the due diligence and the third point I'd highlight is just around planning generally. In the amount of people,
I'm laughing.
But the thing is, the amount of people we get who come to us who literally they want their practice valued and sold, and they're hoping to get the whole thing done within 6 months. Incredibly challenging. But even if you zoom out from that position, in a perfect world, we should be talking to people 3-4 years before they want to sell, because we can look at their position, make some suggestions, improvements to how they perform. That would improve the financial performance, which is going to impact the value. And they're going to get a better exit. Even if it doesn't improve the value, there are things they can do to make sure they can exit smoothly if they give themselves the advantage of time.
I think, as you said earlier on, it's we've sold some businesses. I think most of ours have been relatively straightforward. But
this week's episode is brought to you in partnership with Ultimate Dental Business. We know as guys who have supported dentists for over 25 years and through hosting this podcast that building business skills in dentistry is vital. Time and again, we hear from dentists who tell us that they find the business side of dentistry the most challenging. And we know that stress and pressure comes from doing things we don't feel well equipped to do. That is why we are delighted to be part of Ultimate Dental Business, the new dental business hub delivering top-tier business training for dentists. Founded by Dr. Brad Thornton and Dr. Krupal Shah, Ultimate Dental Business is a response to the lack of robust dental business education currently available. Through our effective collective discussions with dentists, it was clear they most needed good structure and effective guidance to give them the knowledge and tools to be successful dental business owners and to create a business that serves them rather than the business that takes all their time and energy to keep going. To find out more about developing your own business education, click on the link in the show notes or go to ultimatedentalbusiness.com.
It's a stressful time for a clinician who isn't business orientated anyway, because there's delays and there's information requests and other bits of information, because it doesn't just stop. Andy mentioned that, you mentioned the due diligence, didn't you? And then, but that then just generates questions. It's not like, here you go, here's the information and that's it, we're done, is it? It's suddenly that out of that come lots of questions. And I think sometimes it's the questions, isn't it? Because what happens is the due diligence originates, you send it in as a seller, the buyer's solicitor looks at and then asks you loads of questions. But the danger is you don't know the answers. So you've got to go and ask someone else about the questions, which going back to your behavioural change, suddenly looks a bit, why are you suddenly asking me about the contractor?
I think as a seller needs to appreciate that goodwill values are high. So most people are getting a handsome sum for their practice. It's not unreasonable for the buyer, the buyer's bank, the buyer's solicitor and other advisors to want to make sure that what they're getting is right. The details are there. So we appreciate it can be frustrating to have to provide the information, but when you kind of flip that same coin, the buyer does want to make sure that what they're getting is absolutely spot on.
I think you said a really good point there that people, I don't think, consider from a seller's point of view, is quite often, if it's me buying you or you buying me, we have a personal relationship, so therefore we sort of think that the due diligence, we can talk around it, which is good. But what you've got to remember is, I think nowadays I would say virtually every bank appoints its own solicitor, doesn't it?
Yep.
So you have got a truly independent who, remember, is protecting the bank, looking at this due diligence. So it's not enough to say, we're okay with that, because if the bank solicitor isn't okay with it, the deal's not happening.
They won't release the funds.
It's a real important one, because you've got three firms.
Yes.
And one of them is totally independent.
And for me, a lot of this, if you plan it well, you get yourself prepared. And also you can make sure that you kind of deal with any speed bumps that are coming down the road.
Rather than in real time.
Yeah.
There will be those in real time anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the other things I think that we sort of end up with people forgetting or having a misconception is the old lease. I mean, how many times is the question asked? Well, the question is always asked, how long is your lease left? And we quite often get the answers 3, 5, 7 years. And then the next question is, could you get that lease extended to 10 years minimum? And the amount of times we have heard, oh yeah, John,
I know the landlord
he's
really
a great
well.
lad,
It'll be fine.
I've known him. I've been here for 25 years. He's brilliant. Don't worry about it. And what happens is that instead of having that conversation before you even want to sell, so therefore that you're not having a road bump and stressing your way through it, you have that transaction where in reality your deal is now conditional upon this happening.
Yeah.
So if that landlord is not the same lovely bloke that you remembered, and let's all remember, third-party landlords, if you're listening to this, they can sometimes be financially motivated, because in reality, if you've got a 3-year lease left, why do you need to extend it?
From the landlord's point of view, it's like, you've got 3 years. We can do this in 2 years. I'm not in any rush at all.
Why would I bother? So you've then got to let the cat out of the bag that you want to extend it because you're probably selling it. Well, that's potentially a risk. But also, as soon as you let that cat out of the bag, any financially motivated landlord is going to say, ooh, opportunity here.
Yeah.
I'll do that for you, but it's going to cost you £10,000.
Which has happened.
Yeah. What was that one? How much was that one?
Well, we had one 50,000. So the landlord at the last minute basically said that it's not a priority for me, but I can make it a priority. But there's a £50,000 premium to be paid for the extension of the lease. And I think he knew full well that the dental practice sale was close to completion. and completion was dependent on the new lease, and so the seller had no choice but to pay over the premium of £50,000. And this wasn't an expensive practice. I think from recollection it was about a £400,000 practice.
10%.
So
over 10%.
You're talking 10-15% of the sale price. And even if the landlord isn't financially motivated and there's a penalty, premium, whatever you want to call it in there to get the lease extended, they can be slow.
Yeah.
They take forever because, again, it's not a priority for them. They're getting paid their rent month in and month out.
They don't care.
It's just hassle. It's just hassle.
Make it worth my while.
So again, going back to if you start that process earlier and you get all the paperwork lined up, it means you're not going to be waiting towards the end. Because, we know from our experience, assuming that your landlord, landlady is going to be accommodating and move quickly, that's going to be a mistake.
And also here, I mean, isn't it? We get third-party landlords who own properties all over the place, and they live in India or they live in Portugal, and they've got it's that I find it that thing. Oh, he's been a great lad for 25 years, but only in collecting your rent. He's why do you think he's going to be super great, or she could be? It's almost like one of those great ones, isn't it? By familiarity. I know they say familiarity breeds contempt, but it's not. They're not contemptuous, but they think the fact that they're going to be fine. But actually they're going to look for extra money. As you say, do it in advance. Don't wait until you can't sell your practice and book your cruise because the landlord wants 50 grand. It's mad.
I think for me, the last mistake that I've seen over the years is where people don't use a dental specialist solicitor.
It still happens.
And the thing is, there's so many nuances and peculiarities in dentistry. It's so important to get somebody because you've got CQC, you've got the NHS, those notices need to be served. And still, so many practices have NHS contracts. And even if it's only a small one, it still needs to go through the same process.
You still want it transferred, you're paying for it.
There's the property side of things. Depending on what sort of treatments you do, you may have had patients that have prepaid for certain treatments, and there needs to be an allocation of what's been delivered treatment-wise against what's still to be done. There's lots of elements in there. And where we see people looking to use a solicitor who isn't a specialist because they believe it's going to save them some money. In our experience, it doesn't actually save anything. It tends to take longer. In the long run, it can actually cost more because the non-specialist doesn't really know what they're doing, so it can take more time, and lawyers charge on time.
You're learning your job, aren't you?
So I think a specialist, and also a specialist, should be able to line the transaction up so that all the elements come together at the same time. So if they're dealing with the CQC registration, they've served their notice to the NHS, their property department should be working on the property at the same time as a transaction, the dental practice. So you've got those two deals running together so it gets to completion at the right time. But where people don't use a specialist because they use somebody that they who was great when they bought their last house, or they helped them write their will, that, not saying they're not great lawyers. I'm sure they're great, but they just may not have that dental
nuance,
that dental specialism that's needed.
I think we've said to people that it's not so much what's in the contract; it's what's not in the contract. So if you're a seller and you're using a non-specialist and the buyer is using a specialist, there could be things in that contract that shouldn't be there, or should be there. But if your guy doesn't know, they're not going to volunteer it. And as we do know, and I'm sure solicitors might take exceptions to this, we do know that depending on whether they're acting for the buyer or the seller, the solicitors will sometimes ask for different things. Because I know that we say, well, you didn't ask for that as a seller. Oh no, but it's a buyer. So it's that whole thing.
Acting in their client's best interest.
Acting in their client's best interest. So you want someone who's going to act in your best interest. And as you said, Andy, it's that thing, isn't it, that it might cost you a bit more money, or you think it's going to cost you a bit more money. But I tell you what, someone learning your case will cost you lots of money. And what's that great story about the bloke with a hammer? What's that one? Which I always think it relates to a lawyer.
I think it's I don't know if it's a real story or not, but I like it. It's where the submarine, the engine on the submarine isn't working, and the guy turns up and he goes into the engine room with his hammer and he walks around for a few minutes and he gets it out and he gives it a mighty crack on the engine housing, and the engine starts and he leaves and he sends in his invoice for £10,000, and the person in the accounts department says, "This is absolutely outrageous. You were there for 10 minutes." He said, "I can't believe that you're charging me £10,000." He said, "Okay, let me redo the invoice for you." So he sent it back and it said £10 for hitting with the hammer, £9,990 for the experience of nowhere to hit with the hammer. And it's
that sums up being a dental solicitor, doesn't it?
Exactly.
You've got to have that experience to know what are the things that should be in it.
Well, there we go. Hopefully, anyone who's thinking about selling in the future will be able to take some nuggets from there, so they have a nice, smooth
learn not how
exit.
to cock it up.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Dentology, where we discuss the business of dentistry. If you like what you heard, please do subscribe where you found this episode. That would be amazing. And also follow us on Instagram.